Hello everyone, today we talk about 16th century mercenaries and more specifically of a new dynamic that appears starting from this point onwards. It's actually surpassing the old feudal mindset as far as certain aspects, as we will see now, of army administration and organization were concerned. But that actually is in great continuity with the previously traditional, in fact already existing, value of faith, of loyalty, of obedience towards the leaders that characterizes, in fact, Renaissance warfare and professional soldiery, what some would simply define as mercenaries, and that, of course, is a relatively contentious definition. I will not discuss on this aspect specifically, but if you have been following me over the years, you know that it's sort of difficult to distinguish a mercenary from any other soldier, fundamentally. Not just because, of course, the motivations can be really many and overall transcend, in fact, a particular, I'd say, the loyalty to a particular community, especially in a time like this when, I'd say, what we call like the modern state was just being born, but de facto was just a sort of historiographical didactic hallucination. There wasn't such a thing like a state. Was still like an idea of rulers and pre-existing peoples that interacted with one another and in a multiplicity really of agents in a still largely universal framework, but also because of the actual for example, provenance of the same mercenaries from the same countries, of the authorities that were using them, and the ultimate realization that very often these troops were actually better than what you would call like national soldiers in many ways. You know that even throughout, even up to the 18th century, really the watershed is the Napoleonic era, really. You can consider in many ways national troops to be importantly international to a degree, but properly hired, also pressed into the enlistment, and generally speaking, detaching themselves from the rest of society, very much like a mercenary would. What we will see, especially in the end, because we will be reading a couple of sources from the 16th century, is rather the stepping up, let's say, in the art of war, represented by, of course, pike and shot warfare, corresponding to the affirmation of unprecedentedly, say, as centrally controlled armies than before. You can't say properly that the emergence of the modern state has been intended in a fully national sense. You have really to wait, for example, for Louis XIV's France to have what we would more conventionally call a modern national army, right? That is, still there is a great degree of privatization, including of mercenaries, of proper foreigners serving in the French Royal Army, that, however, is mostly composed at that point by actual French subjects, more or less uniformed and drilled in a homogeneous way, right? But the point being that the new power manifesting on Renaissance battlefields is now connected to this only apparently thin thread, apparently, let's say, in relation especially to other communities, that these troops really have with leaders, right? And that actually is not very different from the one that also existed before in the Middle Ages, in the ancient era, meaning that the leader has to contractually satisfy this man. There is something that is must go both ways as a double thread, right, in terms of reliability, of authority, of loyalty, respectively, of actual the contentious aspect was mostly pay, right, and a mostly socio-economical interpretation of history would make you just fixate on that. But it's only when you realize how politically and ideally faithful these troops when paid, really were to the actual leaders, you understand that it's not just about that, and that there was in fact much more to it. And also in terms of the actual effectiveness, in terms cost-benefit ratio, regarding using these mercenaries, as opposed to, in fact, more conventional forms of recruitment. I made lots of videos about early modern armies, explaining essentially how armies were made, how they were composed. Wu was part of them, so we know how uncategorically frameable the concept of a new modern army is exactly in this point of history. However, you also have an idea, for example, of the role of the Swiss. We talked often about them. Those are really the greatest example, if you want, and especially during the 16th century, the Landsknechts. I made a pretty large video explaining also the sort of professional dynamics of this soldiery in a communitary sense, in a sort of union fashion, in a world that was still largely, in fact, feudal, and that really didn't contemplate conceptually something beyond that, right? Other than some greater, smaller hypostatization of power for the way it could be conceived in political theory. So there are many facets of this particular topic. We often talked about early modern soldiery, and mostly like the misery of their conditions, which was yet to fully kick in. Actually, it's something mostly pertaining to the 17th century, to that further dehumanization that pertains to the affirmation at that point of what, as we were saying, we were calling really a modern state. Remember always that the myth of the military revolution basically wanted to make us believe that there was some sort of revolution between 1450 and 1650 that we should all care about. But in fact, the timeline stops to 1650, which is exactly instead the beginning of the other half century, which things literally take off by a magnitudinal scale in comparison to anything that had happened in the previous centuries. It was not called like a revolution or whatsoever. That's yet another stockade that I inflict to what I generally believe, of course, as a medievalist in the eternal competition with modernists, that modern history did not happen, right? Contemporary history did happen, right? After the Code Napoleon, after, say, from 1792 to 1918, as I always say, there is such a thing like a contemporary history, a contemporary state. It's something completely different. Before that, there is no such thing like a modern one between the contemporary and the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was true all the way through, in fact, a couple of centuries before at the earliest, and the concept of modern state is, of course, like it's not completely made up, or at least it's not merely a conventional concept. There are some aspects that you can bring up to make the case, the point. Of course, it was a greater power concentration, etc. But if you actually look at it from a political, institutional, even military point of view, you realize that the continuity from the traditional world, the ancien regime in particular, especially this is true for the history of mercenaries, let's say from the mid-14th to the mid-17th century, and in fact has been in some ways more correctly spotted as some period of on its own for dynamics that in fact are not much institutional, but in that case social. In any case, that's why I wanted to say that I'm not going to digress further on the concept. We understand how big it is. So at the military level, we can of course look at all the different developments from, I don't know, the pike and shot warfare, the shrinking in power of cavalry, the introduction of so-called reiter, think about the caracole, like the role of almost a skirmisher the horsemen would have acquired, which is also a bit too exaggerated, telling the truth. It was a brief temporary thing, and cavalry always was very shock charge oriented, at least properly in the elements that had always existed in order to perform that function. We talked about artillery, and so there is a lot there also in siege warfare, etc. But there is something, in fact, beneath all this, or beyond this, that is informing it, together with politics, that is also the social dimension. There had been, there is an interesting dynamic that I think is somehow overlooked in historiography, that is the hype that European sovereigns for a while had sometime from, say, the mid-15th to the mid-16th century regarding the possibility of actually succeeding in creating such a thing like the one that would happen, in fact, only after yet another century, that is some permanent national armies. They had envisaged that. They had envisaged that for many reasons, because for the first time there was finally the capacity of concentrating enough forces to a degree that could tend towards the unitary direction of an entire country's forces, right? This is especially true for Western Europe, when states, yes, are still feudal, but have managed by that point to convoy, to channel all national forces, at least towards a common effort. Then you would have much less of an entire, say, nationally uniform, and even less permanent force. And this is exactly the point. The idea was that reading classical treatises, for example, looking at the great, say, Macedonian or Roman armies of antiquity, the very much, in fact, classically, traditionally oriented European sovereigns said we should come back to that, because it sounds like a heaven for us, like leaders, descendants of God, that essentially fight in wars, if it were just a sport, right? A great competition between this titanic forces. Reality, however, was too much behind this, right? There is a moment, probably in the mid-16th century, after some disastrous contingencies. First of all, the Protestant Reformation, in fact, mostly the confessional clashes that really undermined that sense of political unity from the universal level to the regional one. We've seen it for the French Wars of Religion. I am making something about the peasant revolts in Germany in the early 16th century, somehow underrated. So there are new times of crisis, of general crisis. The 16th century, actually, the peak of what we call the Renaissance, in a more genuine sense, was actually a terrible time in history. It was probably the single most disorienting one to date. Not even I think the 14th century, the Black Death, as a medievalist, really was something so deeply disconcerting and mind-boggling as Protestant Reformation. America was not really a big deal in comparison, right? What really warfare could do and would do in this incredibly messed up political and religious situation was much more stunning and devastating than practically anything that had ever happened in historical hindsight, at least by that at that point in historical perception. This is expressed at so many levels. Also, think about Baroque, a response a bit to psychologization almost of architectural style, the lack of a center, all this whirlwinds, like the idea of no fixed point really, and that mirrors such disconcertment. We've seen in other videos how, and as I was in fact talking about before, the profession of arms was still pretty much mostly a nobiliar business, right? It was suited at in terms of what politically mattered in a broader sense. Of course, there were many more, as we'll see now, mercenaries from the Fourth Estate than, of course, noblemen that would fight the war, but still, the latter were definitely in charge of the situation, and their role as leaders and fighters was still central in many ways. These were the people who truly had a professional business in war since ever, right? We tend to think about the narrative, like in general now. Now you have the Swiss, you have the Landsknechts, and they are changing warfare. But at the end of the day, who really controls them is princes, right? These peoples technically do not really. This is not a popular force that is bringing out, like in the first half of the 14th century, during the crisis of the great medieval civilization, that really wants to kill the noblemen. These are proletarians paid, maintained, and kept by noblemen, by the great princes of Europe that actually since the mid-14th century have an unprecedented power over any other estate because of the great crisis of that period and the affirmation of the ancien regime. Like this notion, again, the Renaissance, with this time in which humanity reached a new, greater freedom, a new liberty. This is all a pile of BS. Like every person who has even an elementary, medieval, modern historical knowledge perfectly knows that this was the time in which they went under. Like the peasantry, the Fourth Estate were ever more controlled, and there is no. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't like that. In the Middle Ages, the peasantry was much more autonomous in many ways, even though they were actually at the bottom of the ladder. But still, there wasn't such a coercive power of the states and of the princes, right? So it was an exquisitely aristocratic reality. Even in the apparently more egalitarian systems, I mean, we talked about Swiss warfare. If you look at which cantons really ruled, like mostly it was the richer cities projected in the outer world that conditioned the rest of the country. It's also about money, etc. We talk about how to finance armies in early modern Europe. So this the nobility is at the same time witnessing, of course, that there were new groups of professionals, because they were the same ones that they employed, right? This is a point I made also in other videos, debunking the myth that during the Middle Ages, the knights had never, even just in theory, felt challenged by the infantry, by the peasant. There is this notion that, in fact, it's a post-traditional, just populistic, pretty recent one, that attributes the great defeats of cavalry to by infantry in the first half of the 14th century to some sort of the noblemen didn't see it coming because they were too stupid, too egoistic, too selfish, etc. No, they perfectly knew what they got. It's not just, of course, self-evident from the kind of battles they fought or all the planning that we know of, etc. We talked about this for Courtrai, we talked about this for the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and more. There were mitigating factors. In fact, some of these victories were not even technically just about. We remember them because they were carried out by infantrymen, but it's not like in Europe at large, infantry, even when it was actually stronger in absolute terms, ever managed to emancipate itself from cavalry. This is actually even truer to some degree in the Renaissance, even when in fact the infantry did take the upper hand over cavalry. So always remember this, that it was the nobleman that created what we understand like infantry armies in many ways. They literally trained them, they literally, they always did that, they always fought with infantry, and they also advised them when they found themselves, Courtrai is a good example, there were the Counts of Flanders knights behind, or actually in the first ranks of the infantry, that, and not in a meaningfully mounted number, because they didn't have it at that point, that told these infantrymen how to deploy, because they weren't professionals of war. In the Renaissance, instead, the infantry is professional, and it is exactly because there are enough resources that the noblemen can invest in order to train these bodies of men. In fact, a very important aspect to realize, as I was saying before, is that these soldiers were true proletarians. I mean, they didn't really have any source of income other than warfare. Of course, mercenarism wasn't born in the Renaissance. We talked, I think, pretty extensively about it for medieval warfare. But in fact, what is happening here is not a merely mechanical or technical change. It's just like the same ancien regime that creates at a more developed and more robust and more cohesive level these kind of bigger, more powerful armies. They weren't an accident of technology, as some people deterministically believe. It was a majorly voluntary effort by the side of these rulers. And we'll see it better also today. All right. So the upper estates showed to accept themselves, by the way, a heavy tax regime. Think about this, and for all people who complain about military expenses, these were the professionals of war, the true leaders of the situation, and they were the first ones that would tax the country that was run by themselves. So it's not like they were squeezing the peasantry without any, consequence for their own estates, because their estates were worked by peasants. And so it was a great collective effort. These were the people who were invested in that great political checkerboard in the European map that was really witnessing all these major battles and conquests, etc. So without the purse of these men, nobody would have been able to hire mercenaries. This is extremely important. Hadn't these guys paid, this same men would have not fought, right? It's not like an alternative. Society was that tightly regulated, and so without that direction from the above, these peasants, whoever had become a mercenary in that sense, would have not been able to organize an army on their own. And that's why, as I was talking about before, the German peasant revolt, and we've seen this also very well because it's like an offshoot of the later medieval revolt, right? Certain countries arrived a bit later, but this is the same string from the Jacquerie, the Hussites, and more. In fact, were incapable of creating anything relevant in a military sense, in a broader art of war sense, right? These were in many ways true communists of some sort that wanted a veritable revolution. They really want to sabotage the entire system and destroy it, but of course they were destroyed in turn because they did not have an awareness, a capacity, a broader reason to understand that you cannot have that type of society. It does not belong to the world. It belongs to not even to heaven. On the contrary, it belongs to hell. It's a denial of anything. It's the destruction of the same civilization. This is also the reason, of course, why these people served in arms under the noblemen, because they wanted to eat, fine. So that was a good kind of job, and it wasn't that bad compared to just being a peasant breaking his back on the fields. It would have been also often ravaged by the same soldiery that actually did not care very much about anyone, right? Even when they were their own people as well. Let's understand much better also what actual, there were national feelings, but it's not like there wasn't anything else. It was actually a much more traditionally accurate faith, confidence in the hierarchy, right, in authority. So, from their side, the sovereigns of these states experimented quite frequently that the mercenaries, foreign and not, were preferable to even their own subject in arms. Right? The great political institutional battles of these times, the great machinations, the ones that people don't study because they want the battle, like a simplified, clash in which people kill one another, like a cartoon and like on YouTube that mostly presented, actually and largely revolves around military service. Right? Modern state was built on this, was built in many ways approximating also on the passage from the exclusion to serve in arms, right, and to have troops billeted in your own home, to have enough money to actually hire soldiers, including the ones of the same community, so providing them with an opportunity. And in all this, creating a state, a point of reference, somebody that could rationalize, uniform, arm, drill, at a higher level, these forces. If we stick to the 16th century, it's also obvious, and this is really typical from, say, the 14th to the mid 14th to the mid 17th century. Think about the age of the condottieri at that point, and then you have also the indenture from the other side, and you have the 16th century. You have these, say, mercenary armies like the Swiss and so on, and until pretty late in time, in fact, and this is really the divide between truly nationally uniformed armies by the mid 17th century and the older sort of feudal relics, that the mercenary element of the army would remain the most important. And if you pick a random 16th century European army, the qualitative bulk of the army is constituted by mercenaries. These are in fact the professional element, more reliable one, the one that is able basically to destroy the others, except perhaps the nobility that provides, admittedly, still a pretty, say, numerically contained, but also pretty, in fact, qualitative and actually higher, more highly qualitative bulk forces, except they're also often mounted troops. They do have retinues, but as we were saying before, this is not a contest between infantry and cavalry. They act together in combined arms. So it's also true, in fact, that at this point in the Renaissance and the pike and shot era, as the name in fact tells you, mercenaries are themselves often, by the prevailing wide majority, infantrymen. Yes, there are things like times the Reiter. There is a still, if you want, that knight errant that can be hired, and that's where also the as we were saying before, the boundary with, for example, the same nobility is being blurred. All the, say, the mercenary leaders, etc., could be people of course, of obscure background, but at large were so many impoverished aristocrats that, in fact, at the rise of princely states, were notoriously going at war, and it will remain in this fashion. I made a video about the 18th century French officers' appointments. For example, you realize that still at that point, the actual bulk of the French army, if the French Royal Army worked, as also basically the greatest army in the time, it was because of this backbone of small aristocrats that were truly the blood and soul of the army, the truly experienced, competent one, differently from the third estaters, the bourgeois, It was all about the commissions, as you know, at large. It was a way to make a living. But the aristocratic families had a veritable military tradition. And so they still conceptually, morally, personally served, as that was also their only kind of business that to some extent was remunerative. There was a minimal capacity to rise to the ranks in social status. In many ways, that's also at least an indicator you can use to understand how the French Revolution happened, when you realize that in part even that so it's not like much of an aristocratic thing, as you know, but it's as if the peaks of the army were now being simply bought by the higher nobility. It was ever more detached from an actual military competence. Some were pretty good, there's no doubt, but of course the system understood that meritocracy could work much better. Nevertheless, we will talk about this in another video. As you understand, it's all about the degree of things. There is not such a thing like a fixed system that remains always the same in history, right? There are some things that, yes, at the core of, I don't know, say the pre-industrial world, how it functioned in many ways could, of course, remain essentially the same, but it's what is built on top, of course, is very dynamically changing. Now, the mercenaries, going back to our 16th century, if you look at professional troops, and so these hired ones, of essentially volunteers, but because that was the discriminant, were much better, also from a moral point of view, than those pretty dissatisfied subjects that were coactively pressed in. They had to serve according to the to the old militia levy system, etc., but that were not cut for that, right? In part, like the same system had disarmed them, had detached them from that. The system had wanted this to happen. So, of course, in an emergential condition, you could use militia to defend the local province, etc., but the capacity to have, in fact, a subject army that is well equipped, trained, armed, motivated, pertains to much later time. This system has abandoned that since, say, even the beginning of feudal times, if you think about it, in exchange for professional, salaried troops, right? This is extremely important to understand. This is the reason why, of course, mercenaries were loyal to those who paid them, and therefore preferable to subjects that could have, for example, once trained, use against their rulers that achieved ability, that acquired experience, right? This is a reason why, I don't know, for example, the French lost the Italian wars. They had a monstrously enormous military potential, just considering the utterly insane, and I mean, I stress this, the utterly insane demographic and agricultural resources of the great French Atlantic plains. But that system, if armed, right, at a lower level, would have created, as also in a still very in fact aristocratic system, for example, like the French wars of religions would produce, with rebellions, revolts. If you have some discontent veterans that know how to use arms and will pick them up against the establishment, the latter does feel very threatened. Right? That's why, as we've seen also in other videos, the French would essentially use Swiss forces, right, for their infantry at large. They had great cavalry, they had great artillery, but for the infantry, after the experiment of the so-called French, say, Roman legions wanted by Francis I, that turned out to suck completely and were basically disbanded or just used for provincial garrisoning, the most obvious understanding of that nobility establishment was, okay, let's buy the Swiss because they're the best around at this point, talking the beginning of the 16th century, and especially when the war is over, they come back to Switzerland, right? So they do not remain in France. They do not create problem. We don't have to try to build them, to keep them down. That's pretty much it. Naturally, the situation is much more complex than this dichotomy. This is roughly what happened. For example, the Landsknechts were something else in Germany, and part of the peasant revolt were connected with that different reality. In fact, a much less, say, powerfully concentrated authority in Germany as opposed to France. It was really like a massive state, the most updated state at the time. And the Iron Fist, the central authority here is crucial to understand what kind of armies you can have. And think, even in the case of France, how dangerous it was for such a powerful state to have large masses of militarily experienced subjects. As I was saying before, I don't want to digress too much regarding the meaning of mercenaries and what that actually means. You know that the terminology is loaded with very negative bias, starting from Machiavelli to the romantic nationalist idea of the citizen soldier, in fact also echoing because of the classical legacy. It's just a moralistic terminology. I use it just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, not to create misunderstandings. We're not necessarily talking foreigners either, right? They are in many ways, and depending also who is a foreigner. I mean, most countries in Europe at this point had more like of a internal provincial sense of belonging rather than what we would project towards the broader national one. Of course, they were sensitive to, for example, foreign national enemies to invade them, so that's also how, in part, in fact, those very national identities developed in the first place, by distance or proximity. However, we're talking about freelancers of war, right? People that can be hired, that will roam around, that will be available for this military service, and that you don't have to essentially force into the enlistment, because they will enlist themselves under a contract, and so an expectation of compensation. There are advantages, of course, in all this. First of all, as we just said, subjects are better whole, right? Where do you find the money as a state if you don't have people who work and can be taxed and can contribute with the money, but also the natural resources that also can generate further of the former. In mercenarism, there was sort of course, pros and cons. From one side, mercenaries could easily serve as a repression instrument in the case of revolts. On the other, the mercenary troops were by themselves a factor of order, because they reduced the same unemployment, vagrancy, banditry, same begging. So all those problems that proto-modern Europe was afflicted by in abundance. How? Well, in a sense, first of all, as deterrent force, so they could simply kill those who disobeyed. In part, the fact of being, say, troops at least serving detached from their own communities of origin could facilitate that kind of violence. From the other, as we were saying before, these people were often also from the same broader country, and so, for example, unemployment was reduced by giving the young say, aggressive males this opportunity to simply, become soldiers and follow that path, being given an order, structure, a purpose of sort. I again made videos on the social aspects, on billeting, on the creation of first barracks, things like that all were military as social in many ways. When we look at the 16th century, we realize that the mercenary machine was well oiled, right? Yet it could bog down, it could jam, as all machines, for only one reason. At least there are many reasons, but at large, a main one: the lack of fuel. And of course, the mercenary fuel was pay, right? Pecunia nervus belli. The French had a more brutal, less aulic, but somehow also more effective proverb, that is to say, pas d'argent, pas de Suisse. That is, no money, no Swiss, as we were pointing out before in that particular dynamic of the French military. In case of scarce entity, or especially of delay in the correspondence of salary, the Swiss, the Landsknechts, immediately deposed pikes and halberds, or even they actually picked them up instead, in order to make themselves heard. And then they wouldn't point those weapons against the enemy, of course. What is fascinating about the Swiss and the Landsknechts is how we, of course, made lots of videos about them, telling the truth, so explaining the differences. But you see that the result, in many ways, was the same. Like, the Swiss were essentially a people, an independent people, de facto, selling their service, in fact, at this national level, to various foreign powers. To some degree, of course, many Swiss broke the laws that were, however, specifically implemented by their own government, not to serve autonomously. There had been other cases in history. Think about the Genoese, that were actually not just random Genoese, were properly sent by the Republic of Genoa to France. What is fascinating about the Swiss is that they had paradoxically affirmed themselves against the most aristocratic regimes out there. Just the other day I made a video about the Burgundian state, and the relations weren't how successful the Swiss turned out to be, that they eventually sold. So in political, cultural, say, moral terms, the Swiss emerged as a sort of as an exceptional in this sense, truly, like, say, confirming the rule, otherwise of the opposite, an egalitarian power that, however, began to serve the single most disproportionately aristocratic power in Europe, that was France. The Landsknechten were something else. Were technically they were an imperial estate designed to, in fact, provide this updated soldiery to the Holy Roman Emperor, but they were virtually like some German army, some, we can say, official German army per se, because again, Germany in particular was also slightly less updated system. It was more feudal, so estate is a better word, and the Landsknechten have also a lot to do in, psychologically speaking, with the constrictions that the German peasantry had compared to other countries. The fact that for them, this estates, these rights, corresponded to something akin to, especially for a country like Germany that had historically monopolized at least the concept of the empire itself. Like, so the cingulum militaris, the right of the freeman, but in this sense, traditionally, in the Romano-Germanic tradition, the freeman that is also a nobleman in the measure in which he bears arms, right? However, so you would expect the Landsknechten to be just more loyal to the general national principle. These were peoples that, saving Vienna from the Ottoman siege at the beginning of the 16th century said, look, if you don't pay us now, we will do to Vienna what the Turks haven't done to her. These are the same people that, in many cases, serving a Catholic emperor were Lutheran, such as their same, say, creator, this next to Maximilian. We'll see now, Georg von Frundsberg, we have some passages, some excerpts about his deeds, would sack Rome, right, which was an inane tragedy that created a massive issue to the entire empire. To Charles V, it was just a total disaster in the entire history of mankind. However, in that case, we should point out that the Landsknechts were not so vicious in sacking Rome as the Catholic Spaniards were with them. And so you realize that in terms of actual fealty, a mercenary, a foreign mercenary, or just a national soldier weren't really that different in practice. And the reason is that, as we were saying before, there are different layers to the political and social background and international situation, and the same military dynamics that you have to appreciate. That's why the term mercenary, as these are good examples to compare in order to dilute the term mercenary to begin with. So there is a sense, we'll see it better in the end, of broader loyalty. I mean, being paid was a right of these people. They weren't just slaves they were fighting for no reason. They were freemen, and as such they required actually what had been promised to them in pretty formal, solemn fashion, and that also incarnated, as we just pointed out, actually quite strongly traditional, even imperial meanings. Because these people are fighters, they're not they're not workers, they're not priests, they're people who were supposed to incarnate the same divine glory, God-given glory through their military activity, right? So their voice had to be heard, and would be heard because of their military capacity. Remember that these are now the great forces of the time. The Swiss are sort of an independent army that moves on its own. I mean, it's supplied when it's in somebody else's service by, in fact, foreign powers, etc., but they are autonomous in that provision. In a sense, this is valid also for the Landsknechts, at least in the moment in which they are on the field. This is the 16th century. You don't have helicopters, tanks. These masses of men are basically unstoppable, if not by other masses of men in that fashion. So they're quite dangerous, and you have to mind them politically as well. So what they would typically do, like protesting, they had literally their own unions that at the end of the day, unsurprisingly, ended up betraying them for personal interest. And so that's why by the beginning of the 17th century, Landsknechts are not a thing anymore. Specifically, the Swiss had declined before this time. In any case, they would typically, in the days of glory, gather in assembly, like the older meetings in arms. So really having within themselves a sense of power makers, right? Because the sovereign's arms depended in part on them. Again, if they had had the capacity of getting the upper hand of it, there would have been a revolution. That was not the case, but still, like, depending on what the sovereign's plans were, things could turn, like as we've seen with the sack of Rome, for example, in an incredibly disastrous way for the entire imperial policy, and practically something that didn't make any sense along that line. It's a very good example, by the way, just like the threatening of the Viennese by the same Landsknechts in the same years. So they would mutiny as well. That was what had happened in the circumstances. There was also the old peasant or mountaineer habit in the case of the Swiss. In any case, we're talking Fort Estaters, to communitary discussion, debate, even in pretty violent, ruthless ways. I mean, entering the ranks of this man meant that you really would go under massive brutality, vicious human breaking and remolding into, in fact, fanatic as perfectly efficient killers, reclaiming their own rights, right? And there is a passage I would like to read you. Actually, a couple. The first is from the memoir of Philippe de Comines. We're at the beginning of the 16th century. You know, Philippe de Comines is one of the great, so these great figures. He was born around the 40s of the 15th century, so he was old enough to remember the 100 Years' War, to have gone through the recompaction of the French monarchy, its military. He participated, as we'll see now from this passage, to the Italian wars. And he was a great, we cited him in different videos, including, in fact, the ones on the creation of the first, what is considered, historically at least or conventionally, the first nucleus of a permanent army, at least in France. Saint Philippe de Comines says that was actually the Italian lords in the north of the peninsula that the same French kings took example of from quite a while. But he's considered one of the greatest, at least military authors of the time, which is not to be given for granted, because military was mostly involved in warfare, not in the letters, even though these people could be really knowledgeable. I made a video about the, say, libraries of Henry IV and Louis XIII's generals, which are quite interesting because they read very moral stuff and they didn't care absolutely anything, though they were great generals, about military treatises. That's yet another topic I will completely avoid to touch, but you know what I think about it. Especially at this point, military theory was not simply capable of, positively handling warfare as a whole. And the other passage we'll read after this is by Reisner, die Historia Herrn Georgen und Herrn Caspar von Frundsberg. Right, this was published in Frankfurt in 1599. However, both passages talk about the Italian wars, but respectively about the Swiss and the Landsknechts. So here is Philippe de Comines. So as soon as we came from having the Duke of Milan swear an oath of peace, and the Venetians were, do you understand, this is part of the Italian wars, had taken more than 2 months of time to ascertain the peace or not, because they didn't want to commit themselves for more. Also, the king, so here it's talking about the king of France, swore his oath, and the following day he decided to leave, having him and his company a great desire to come back to France. But that night, the Swiss that were in our camp held many meetings, each with the ones of their own cantons. This is beautiful. They played their drums and they held a ring that it is their way to hold a council. These things were told to me by Landsknechts, that had always been one of their leaders. You see here that they had French officers, and that understands well their language, because of course they spoke German mostly. This Landsknechts, slept in the camp, and he went during the night to warn the king. Some Swiss said that, intended to essentially capture the king of France, and some of his men, especially the richest ones, that could be ransomed. Others were agreeing on this, but they wanted that they at least to ask him about, to try ask him for the arrears of 3 months of pay, saying that the king had promised all this and all the times that they would have gone and come forth together with their insignia. So that this should have been the actual case for which it would have to be paid. Others wanted only the leaders to be captured without touching the king, and they were ready to do this immediately. Many of them were already in the city, but before they had concluded anything, the king left, and he went to Trino, in the land of the Marquis of Montferrat. The Swiss were, however, wrong, because they had been promised actually only 1 month of pay, and they had served for only 5 days. This is very interesting. So they ended up to come to an agreement. Those who had been with us in Naples took first prisoner the bailiff of Dijon and the same Lornay that had always been their leaders for having 2 weeks of pay in order to dismiss, to go out to disband. The others instead had 3 months of pay, and everything amounted to 100,000 francs. And the Swiss wanted to be granted with, of course, like this, with promises, hostages, right? All this happened because of some French that actually instilled in the Swiss this idea. This is, I mean, it's tragicomical in many ways. And it was one of their captains to say it to the Prince of Orange that in turn said this to the king. And this was because they did not like the fact that the French had made peace in Italy. And so they wanted to stay longer, but in order to be paid. So this passage itself, it's so beautiful in so many ways. First of all, there is all the sort of ethnic national traditions, these guys that hold meetings still in the same cantonal form. You see how actually, well, the Swiss were really unique in their genre. The Landsknechts and were a bit more diluted already, but you see that these guys actually serve abroad, but still within the communities of their own land, with each one in their own canton. And there is all this quid pro quo given essentially a malevolent French suggestion. This is naturally commune writing, but it's not like the Swiss had to be simply told that they could use this force in order to get paid even more than they should have. Nevertheless, it tells you how sort of difficult it was to keep an army together. We see here that there were soldiers had fought throughout important long campaign. I mean, the French ones in Naples had been a thing. There were the fact, as we said, that there were French officers leading them. So remember what we said at the beginning. These were pikemen at large, and yet, of course, the French aristocrats commanded them, and these men obeyed, but for pay. And finally, the most beautiful thing of all is that it's not like these people did not want to make war, right? Of course, they would have liked to get the money and to go back home without doing anything, but of course, that was not quite possible. What they wanted, at least without using violence, what they wanted was actually to remain in the army. They wanted to remain fighting. And here, the reason why this all happened in practice is that the French had signed a peace with the Italian enemies, and the king came back to France. And so the Swiss say, if this is the case, we're going to be disbanded. Instead, we want money. We want a longer, we want to pay for a longer time than this. This is beautiful because it tells you how such considerations would influence the same political and diplomatic strategic outcomes of the war. Then we have this other later source that talks about the sort of the father of the Landsknechten, Georg von Frundsberg, that we will discuss in some other video, but this is essentially the true founder of the Landsknechten, together with Emperor Maximilian, a man of enormous courage, of sort of, man of his time. So it was actually a small aristocrat. He himself incarnated this new venturism that, in a sense, the same Landsknechten represented, in spite of the fact that they were supposed to be properly the imperial army. So let's simply read and comment this. So the Lord of Frundsberg had the German troops turn and massen it at the sound of drum, like the Swiss you see here. They hated each other, by the way, but of course they were also similar. In fact, the Swiss were actually better. They were tougher. But okay, we'll see this better in another video. We talk about this in the introductory one to the Italian wars. But the camp life, the general ethos, were of course very similar. So Frundsberg had a square made, and he placed himself in the middle together with the prince and some captains on March the 16th, and this with great seriousness he expressed roughly this opinion, is paraphrased. Quote, "Dear sons and brothers, of their complaints we have discussed with the Duke of Bourbon, Imperial Vicar, and we have asked its and solicited its execution to the Duke of Ferrara. But at the moment we cannot obtain anything, since up to now, in all the dangers and the adversity, I have always found the sincere spirit of yours be well disposed. I hope that also now you will want to desist from this untimely mutiny, avoiding to us all the damage and the shame. You know that up to a few days ago, together with me, you have unanimously approved not to separate ever the ones from the others, but to live and die together up to the point at which we will be paid and satisfied, and we want to reflect on this. Since you have suffered for so long, right? Essentially, please suffer still a bit more, and none of you let himself sort of be, excited to be ruined. We are on the path to find the Emperor's enemy, the beginner of this war, and we want to take Rome, to take in Rome our pay, honor, and glory. Otherwise, now we can't discuss the salary, because the Emperor is too far. In addition to this, the Duke of Bourbon and the Prince of Orange, that are together with me, and then all the captains, have committed themselves to pay all the salary that is owed to you at the end of this month, and that in the meanwhile, for you will be put in common what we take, and what we take as the leaders and all the captains. Reflect instead, dear sons and brothers, what would happen if we split, if we broke apart, and we would not remain united and in agreement. How we have surrounded ourselves by strong enemies. Remember that Frundsberg motto was many enemies, much glory. We would fall in their hands, and none of you would come out of it alive. Right? Consider this was literally on campaign. But if we remain close as brethren, we can hope from God a certain victory. Right? This is actually, well, of course, this is a story, but it's a pretty plausible speech that he would have held in this circumstance. Like, this is a granitic reason and seriousness that would have at least rhetorically convinced everyone. However, given this serious allocution and the ones made by the Prince of Orange and of by other captains in his name, could not actually obtain anything from the angry groups of soldiers. And in fact, the Landsknechts instead continued to cry, "Money, money," right? Lowering their lances and turning them against their leaders. And so this is why Frundsberg, in the midst of the square, so showing that he was not scared, of course, to be surrounded by all of them, for the indignation and like essentially a stroke, had a this incident that, as you know, is also part of the reason why later Rome got sacked, because he got an ictus fundamentally, and here the story is that he couldn't eventually just speak or stand, and so he remained broken in that way, and that's how actually was knocked out. This is evidently of course, a pretty serious mutiny, a pretty violent episode, and this is the point of it all that we will make now in the end. That is to say, there was a sense of loyalty, a sense of control. The same Frundsberg was a sort of controversial figure because of this obsession. He had a golden loop that he brought tied to his horse, with which he foolishly said that he wanted to hang the Pope. That this is, the degree by, as we were saying before, like that sort of ideological factors were all intertwined, but even more for this reason, the fact that he was so strongly loyal, right, to the general enterprise, and the fact that, of course, he wanted to maintain an obedience that they didn't have to break forces, etc., was sort of kind of obvious because of the disaster that followed later. That also during the sack of Rome, plague spread, lots of the same Landsknechts died, so it's actually a terrifying story. Consider all how relevant the role of leader here really is. And so the fact he got a stroke and was effectively broken in this shows you how higher the purpose, like the sense of honor and control for a commander really was. This was a man who faced the French cavalry in the front ranks of the Landsknechts themselves at the Battle of Pavia a couple of years before. You have really the epitome of courage, of bravery, of that sense of leadership, of charisma, and the guy gets destroyed. He destroys himself basically because he understands he has no control in the forces anymore. And I presume that also much of this is connected with the traditional realization that if you do not know how to control your troops, basically it's primarily your fault. I mean, it's their fault as much as it's yours, but you're in charge, so it's actually worse. You're responsible for the wall. And the situation is that difficult. So when he had this stroke, Tambourine even offered him a drum of his, and he sit on there, and so here the captains and the cavalry commanders, so these were the heads of the mercenaries and of also this other noblemen interspersed. They entered the square, so to show that they they were not scared because they would have been trapped. Squares at this point were working like that, and they could have not come there alive. So they admonished the troops once again. They asked which fault did their leaders have to be so unhappy towards them. And they told them, "Dear brethren, just go back to your places, to your lodgings. Be calm." Sounds like the meme. Keep calm and status, and be tranquil. In fact, and we will see what we can do. And these are very dramatic situations because it can also escalate in pretty violent ways, right? So when the Landsknechts moved away from the square, Frundsberg's servants helped him mount his donkey, on which he went everywhere apparently, and brought him to his pavilion, right? So basically there is this table at which he used to, eat as a prince together with all the captains, and Frundsberg is just instead sitting there, unable of speaking, right? Everybody was sad, everybody tried to console him, but he couldn't speak, right? He really had cerebral damage, and he ate anyway, and he placed himself close to the fire, and then at that point he got a fever. So they brought him to bed, where he laid there sick as in pain, but without saying anything. In fact, they thought he would have died. And so the German captains were sad for this mutiny, even more for the loss of their commanders. This was a pretty ominous event, because without the commander, you see, this is what true soldiers are. Without a leader, right, the entire thing falls apart. What you really need to keep things together, just strong figure that will either find a way or create one, right, as another great leader the past sent. And so they go on across. This is close to Bologna in northern Italy. The Germans do not have much food. Some of them were crying. So the source says that Klaus Seidensticker, that was an old and brave captain, stated, "If God helps me come out of this war, I swear, I swear not to actually make any other war for all my life, because of what has just happened, right? And because of how, understand how serious the situation is. Like, without a leader, these guys are essentially exposed to the enemy. They risk, as the Frundsberg before the stroke himself said, like, they're cut us to pieces if we break down, right? So the source, which is the same as before, says the great, according to what, regarding what Seidensticker said, the great lords work in concert among each other. They make peace and war when they want, and us that have loyally served the emperor are all destined to butchery. They think to their advantages, and they let us rot away. There's a bit of a, almost socialistic complaint, but it's actually not. I mean, it's not in the sense you call it like that, but it's the usual story. This head of state, what bastards! We are the ones who make it to war, and they are sitting somewhere comfortable, and they don't have this problem. This is not exactly what they were doing. We're always a step away from disaster, and they had actually even more serious things to think about than this situation. and in fact things would pretty go down. But it was everybody's fault because those were the leaders as well in turn. So it's like the Frundsberg here, right? They're broken. They have everything on their shoulders, and it's so terrifying. And so, dear brethren, we who have loyally served the emperor. What you see here actually is what I was hinting at the beginning of the video. There is something logical and fatal that the sovereigns would search, of course, within the limits of possible, to gradually advocate themselves, and in the measure in which it was possible, even to manage, to organize, or at least ever and better to coordinate and control the mercenary troops. In words like these, spoken by the latter, show the levitation of a spirit of, let's say, intertwined body with it, that as it's been considered in the old Notizia Contuberni and the new communitarian, all the new communitarian brotherhood inspires a great sense of actual fealty towards some points of reference, right? All these great lords that more or less great lords that sit on drums and call the troops German mountaineers. I mean, just Fort Essayders, dear brothers, right? It's a bit like Henry V. Remember that, at least in Shakespeare, because it is changing. It's something more of the later times. You see in these soldiers, between these soldiers and these leaders, a connection. There is a recognition that the soldiers have of themselves in these leaders. They believe in them, they trust them. As we've seen without Frundsberg, the same subordinates do not know what the hell to do. The armies melt in a way. So you can argue that through all the torments of this new early modern warfare, there was the creation of a new spirit that had contacts with the ancient values, and that now autonomously and originally adapts, of course, to the new times, to the new dynamics. So that there is a time, I made a video specifically about this, which was the one on you will find it if you go into medieval. It ends with "to scum of the earth." I mean, there is this concept that in the 16th century, especially, the soldier, especially individuals like the Landsknechts, had sort of ennobled the older and depreciated soldier, mercenary, right? Still in the 15th and 14th century, mercenaries were considered something less from properly the higher leaders, right? And especially the lower soldier was seen as just, yes, people who had some sort of, maybe if they were already in fact professionals of arms, something greater than the average fighter, but still were mostly considered because of their lower status. Think in the 13th century there's a lot of mercenarism already, but there's also a very strongly marked social divide and feudal hierarchy in that, and so lesser people are truly lesser people. By the 16th century, this reactivation is this, in many ways it's a perspective distortion, especially because of the Swiss and the Landsknechts, and that's why we talked about them at this point. In other parts of Europe, especially in the East, it wasn't like that at all. In the West, as we've seen, like the more advanced forms of recruitment and coactive, in fact, enlistment would bring once again soldiers to be even more depreciated than before, to the ever more expandable, ever more worthless. Think of how important the Protestant mentality was to this. Like the works are zero, humans are zero, and therefore you can do them whatever you want. They're all intertwined. There's also a Catholic culture that develops this, but the sense, at least in a different way, but that it's all baked into the way, at the end of the day, war hybridizes everything. So, say it's just like one side of the aisle brought something, the other something else, and things were composed. Like our, say, modern military culture was made like that. And so, you have, instead in the 16th century, some more honorable perception of a fighter like a Landsknecht, right? Something closer to the idea of bellator and miles as opposed to some sort of lower servant or just simply, a villain or a peasant, right? And courage, honor, and fealty are actually expected in theory from these men, right? They are expected as a mark of, in fact, fidelity to the same princes as we've seen here that would field them, would fight with them, would share blood with them, which is interesting because from one side it looks at the ennoblement of this particular type of soldiery, but from the other it also speaks of a sort of crisis of the same nobility. As I said before, this depends on which areas of Europe we're talking about. I think, again, the example of the Swiss and the Landsknechten is so era-making that you can approximate it just to them. It would be interesting actually to study this in parallel, like what was going on in other countries, meaning who were, I don't know, the soldiers that otherwise were used in... there is a sense of this, for example, in Spain, right, with the Spanish tercio and nobles who were participating to that. And you know that in the Spanish and later probably in the Habsburgic pike and shot tradition altogether, noblemen start as humble pikemen from within the lower ranks. Obviously, the leaders that are often also their relatives, etc., have a particular regard for them. But there is that change. There is that, closing between noblemen and soldiers. But let's say, what about, I don't know, in Scandinavia, right? Or say, well, admittedly, the biggest, the more advanced type of warfare is in the West, right? So definitely it's not a coincidence that things happen in this way. But as we've seen, these mercenaries also come from the from areas, at least from estates that were poorer, and so there is this. Traditional times, the Middle Ages itself, are so close for these men to fully understand that they are given a chance as soldiers. This is, again, especially true in the German era. I think really not much the Swiss, but the Landsknechten were believing this, right? An Italian, a French, even an English would have thought of this differently already, because they had, in many cases, either more modernized or secularized, or in other cases disarmed or gentrified communities that had even reached like a sort of greater understanding of what warfare should be organized, like in what it would essentially become later, mostly. Instead, it's as if Germany had been in the Middle Ages still, in mentally speaking, and so even though there was nothing there from the Landsknecht side to create, a national army or something, because Germany was not, in fact, not ready, was not up to date. For them, this attempt, this injection into the fray, corresponded to something much more empowering and exalting. So, again, this does not happen, to Scandinavian or Italian peasants. This is, for how different they could be, there is this strange time of the 16th century in which really equally strange things happen, including, again, the temporary elevation of what would have been like a medieval peasant to some soldiery level that emboldens him. But at the same time, the general establishment is also starting to gentrify for many reasons, gradually though, and also just because of the technicalities of warfare, starting to fight more close to these men. And so something that would eventually blend in the molding of the resettling of this world, that at the end of the day would know not necessarily less upheavals later, but something more orderly still within the ancient regime that reinforces itself, together with the fact the general order and stability that also through these troops is able to provide. Just remember, these things had never been done before to this scale in, say, medieval times, or at least this is debatable, but let's say that in this was to stay, like the needs for these types of troops, from this types of polities, for this kind of international clashes had been were new. Like medieval times, things happen in slightly different ways, and so that's the crazy combination that comes out, or at least say the random one apparently, that however has a very specific, as cogent reason. Like, it's not so strange after all. Now, for today, however, stop it here. We'll keep talking about these topics further in other videos. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.